This episode of Tales from Atlantis is brought to you by Atlantis Premium. Don't you just hate having your favorite podcast interrupted by ads like this? Well, dear listener, you're in luck. Because starting at just $3 a month, you can support independent Chicano media and receive ad-free episodes, premium episodes, bonus content, and access to our Discord server. Just visit talesfromatlantis.com and click Go Premium, or follow the link in the show notes. And now, on with the show.
You must excuse me. I've grown quite weary.
This hasn't been easy, I know. But you've learned a lesson. A lesson in honesty. Honesty to yourself and honesty to others. That lesson will stand you in good stead all your life.
I think we've all learned a good lesson. I've always heard that honesty is the best policy. Now I'm catching on to why that's so, and why that's so, and why that's so.
Greetings, dear listeners, and welcome yet again to Tales from Atlantis. This is part 2 of our interview with Dr. Luis Herrán Ávila about the presidential election in Mexico and right-wing movements in Mexican politics. If you have not listened to part 1 yet, I highly recommend that you go back and do so. Now, on with the show.
I seem to recall back during his run for presidency, Fox, wasn't he criticized for having connections to Sinarquismo? Wasn't that one of the criticisms that was kind of levied against him at the time? And that's why a lot of people were kind of had hesitation towards voting for him or for him being the head of the PAN, right? Because he was the
he was the candidate for the PAN. Yeah. I mean, this has to do with the PAN's longer history of being, again, this center-right party that has always had within the party a wing of the party that's a little bit more to the right, right? And sometimes quite a bit more to the right. So folks that were, for instance, in El Yunque, a lot of them actually started their political careers in the PAN, right? For instance, I have studied some youth and student groups that became kind of neo-fascist groups in the 1960s and 70s that had their beginning of their political trajectory within the PAN. So the PAN is this within the PAN, there's a range of right-wing politics, including the extreme, the most extreme versions. No? So a lot of the Yunque actually comes from the PAN. Someone, again, to go back to Verástegui, someone like Verástegui would say, no, the PAN is definitely not the type of right that we want, and is the fake right, or the, as he calls them, the la derechita cobarde. It's a fascinating term. It's like the coward, petty right.
Wow.
And that's not the true right.
Yeah.
It's hard to say what is the status of El Yunque right now because again, it's a secret organization. But what you were saying, Curly, about those connections with Spain, that's been one of the interesting developments in the past 20 years for the organization, is that they went outside of Mexico.
That's kind of what I was alluding to earlier when I was talking about CPAC being sort of like this international conglomerate of conservative organizations. And it kind of reminded me of that conversation we had about El Yunque. And I wanted to see if you could make that connection there. Do you think that there is any connection between the two, or they're still kind of maintain a separation at this point?
I think they're allies. No? Some people that are members of El Yunque might be participating in these CPAC events, or kind of just gravitating around the same people, right? The same meetings and so on and so forth. But I think they remain separate, partly because El Yunque has its own history and its own kind of ideology, let's say. But they're willing to work together with these international allies like CPAC, or maybe right-wing movements in, Argentina, Chile, Brazil, right? Spain, so on and so forth, right? And the Catholic connection is what matters a lot for them.
So you know how I'm sorry, Curly, but like the way that Tecos have been known to have been involved in some nefarious actions, including murder and political assassinations, is the Yunque also tied to any of that? Is there a history of them doing similar activities?
Yes, absolutely. I was just precisely in writing the book that I'm working on currently. I found these documents that tell, for instance, stories of Yunque members that were arrested by the police for whatever reason, and then they just spill the beans, right? That they belong to the secret organization, that they've been conducting paramilitary training, things like martial arts, the handling of weapons, things like guerrilla warfare training. Right? And this is something that we see also in documents that talk about the Los Tecos. Right?
And how long ago?
This was, at least the documents that I was looking at, it's kind of early 70s.
Okay.
And that's something that journalists that have been tracking El Yunque more recently talk about, interviewing members of El Yunque or former members of El Yunque who also give testimonies about this type of indoctrination and training. So they are very similar in that sense. The thing with El Yunque and Los Tecos is that they eventually, at some point, they had a fight over basically the control of what we can call the kind of Catholic right-wing umbrella. Who's going to lead this? Is it going to be us, Los Tecos, or you, the Yunque, right? And it also had to do with the fact that Los Tecos, I think I spoke about this in that last time that I was in the show, that Los Tecos were advocates of this idea that the Catholic Church after the 1960s was no longer the real Catholic Church.
Yeah, Vatican II, right?
Vatican II,
Vatican
right?
II.
The Second Vatican Council, and that they said, well, the current Pope is actually a communist and a crypto-Jew, so we shouldn't trust him. And Yunque actually pushed back against that idea. And that's where there was a split, right?
Okay, because I was going to ask, do either of those groups, El Yunque or the Tecos, I was going to ask, were they either of them affiliated with Catholic monarchism? This idea that it would be a theocratic state with the Pope as the head of the government, and they're very orthodox. And there used to be a guy he would send me hate mail all the time from Arizona, of all places. He hates this podcast. Shout out if you're listening, by the way. Miss your texts and emails. But he would send me these bizarre memes of Catholic monarchist ideology. It just made me think, I wonder if either of these organizations, but it sounds like one of them, at least the Tecos, would be more inclined to have, install their own pope, right? If they see Vatican II as fraudulent, and then the Yunque would be satisfied with just having whoever is the current pope, the head of the church.
Right.
That's interesting.
They have these kind of what to us might seem like very slight ideological differences. A lot of similarities for sure. I think both would have some version of this kind of a theocracy as an ideal. But then again, at least that split or that clash that they had with regards to Vatican II, the reforms in the Catholic Church, and then Pope Paul VI. For one side, he was a communist and a crypto-Jew, and for the other side, it's he's the Pope, he's infallible, and we'll just follow his lead, right?
Mm-hmm.
So, but both groups or both factions would still adhere to this idea of, for instance, a Hispanic Catholic culture and the legacy of Spanish culture in Mexico and in all of Latin America, and an admiration, at least, for the Spanish monarchy, right? And what they did for us as a culture, so on and so forth. This idea of hispanismo, or rather hispanidad, as a unifying, defining trait of Mexican culture. Both groups adhere to that for sure. Now, there's other currents of monarchism. For instance, in Brazil, it's very strong actually among the Brazilian right, who want to see a restoration of the monarchy.
Wow.
And it's okay, but then that's the Portuguese monarchy that at some point was based in Brazil, right? They see Brazil as the actual heart of the old Portuguese Empire. No?
Yeah.
But that's a whole other...
So not an extension of, but as the heart of...
The actual, exactly. Yeah, Portugal is a tiny little nation that was extracting resources from the real empire.
Wow.
I had a friend back in the day who would say this little phrase hay radicales entre radicales los hay, something to that effect. So even within radicalism, there's extremes of radicalism that disagree with each other, and this is a perfect example of that. So I guess we were wondering too, I don't know, Curly, if you had any other questions, but we wanted to ask you if you could tell us a little bit about your current project, what you're working on, and how soon you think the public might be able to have access to some of those materials once you're done with them.
So I did have one more question.
Oh, you do? Okay. Well, go ahead.
So one thing, getting back to Eduardo Verástegui one thing that he is doing, so he produced this movie, Sound of Freedom, right? Which got super popular for some reason. And it's not a good movie. And it's based on this organization called Operation Underground Railroad. And the leader of this organization has been called out as being a fraud and just like his organization's bullshit. And he's being sued right now by multiple people. But before all of this, and even working with the same director, I found that one of his first movies was a movie called Bella. Have you heard of this? He is directed by Alejandro Gomez Monteverde, who also directed Sound of Freedom. And it was written by Monteverde and produced by Eduardo Verástegui. And what's funny about this movie, I mean, it's terrible. It's a terrible movie. And of course, Eduardo's in it. He plays one of the main characters. But it's like this slick anti-abortion movie, but it's not overtly, like it's not marketed as being, a Catholic anti-abortion movie. And it's very tricky the way they do it. The plot is very simple. It's set in New York City, something that doesn't make sense later on in the narrative of the movie. But there's a Mexican restaurant in New York City, and there's this young woman who works there as a waitress, and she comes in late and she's like, I was sick, I couldn't come in. And then, she gets yelled at and fired. And I mean, it's bad. I'm just going to tell you what it is so you don't have to watch it. So she leaves, and then Eduardo's character, who's the cook at the restaurant, follows her, and he's like, hey, what's wrong? And turns out she's sick because she's pregnant. Right. And so they go around the city and he talks to her and like, well, what are you going to do? And she's like, well, it rhymes with shmushmorshin is what I'm going to do. And for all your little baby ears out there. But the guy's, you wouldn't consider giving your child up for adoption? And, so he takes her to meet his family. He spends the whole day basically, clandestinely trying to convince her not to have an abortion. And she meets his family and she finds out that his brother was adopted. And, you should really give up, your daughter or whatever, your child for adoption. And then we find out that Eduardo's character had like killed a little kid while drunk driving or something. So he's like, feels bad about, so there's like all these hammering over the head type stuff about, killing children, juxtaposing, this dead baby, it's all fucked up. It's the silliest plot. But then it ends at the very end. You find out that, this is where they get the title of the movie from. Bella, she decides to have the baby, and Eduardo's character has adopted the baby. So now they're playing on the beach, and it's all, so it pulls all the right heartstrings. Like if you're somebody who thinks that Lifetime movies are quality, you would probably watch this, and the message would go over your head that it's just been jabbing you in the face with, right? Like you wouldn't even recognize that it's an overt anti-abortion film. It wasn't marketed that way. It's very innocuous looking. But what I don't get is, and the little girl's name is Bella. So that's where they get the title of the movie. She has the baby, names it Bella, then Eduardo Verastegui's character adopts the baby. But my question was, he's a cook in New York, like in Manhattan. How the hell can he afford? Like
you're looking for coherence where there is none. So
Jesus is magic, Curly. Come on, you know that.
It's just
Jesus
so
will
funny
provide.
that, because the message, obviously, and it plays to this larger message of people who are against the women's reproductive rights, is they don't understand reality. All they're fixated on is, no, abortion is bad. You should adopt. And it's like, well, that's sometimes not possible, one. And two, who the fuck are you to tell me when I should and should not have a family?
I think, Curly, I think what you're saying here is the criticism is not so much that the guy adopted the kid, but that he was allowed to adopt it to begin with. What's going on with the adoption agency? That they're not looking at this guy's finances and figuring out that the guy is only a cook? And can he afford to adopt a kid in Manhattan? On
yeah, and salad? It says here, you were in prison for killing a child. Here's another one.
We'll be back after a quick break.
Have you picked up your Mexica calendar for the year 12 Flint? Or how about a paperback copy of The Four Disagreements? Just visit talesfromastlantis.com for all the latest merchandise and show some love for your favorite podcast. That's talesfromastlantis.com for all the latest merchandise. Now, back to the show.
Yeah, I mean, and of course, zero criticism of the adoption system, which has its own issues, right?
Exactly.
Yeah.
These people think that you just give up the kid for adoption and they're going to find a family for them and everything's going to be just A-okay. Like they have no clue as to what it really takes for someone to be adopted and how many years a lot of these kids end up in the foster system, going from one family to the next. And I mean, it becomes very traumatizing. And it's not that simple. Everything's so facile for people who think in these black and white terms, and I feel sorry for them sometimes because I wonder, like, what is really going on in your mind? Like, how is this the kind of thinking that you have on a daily basis as you're making important decisions in your life? Like, do you not really think things through and really rationalize the implications of the decisions that you're making, and especially those that you're trying to make on someone other's behalf?
Yeah. And those are the people that a movie like this is made for. Like, that's the audience for this movie. The people who think like that, who'll just watch a movie and be like, yeah, why don't they just give up their babies for adoption? It's so simple.
Yeah, why not? It's so simple.
Why shouldn't I be allowed to tell other people what to do with their bodies?
And with that, Luis, tell us about your book.
Where's your book?
And just wanted to add to something that Curly said at the end, right? It's how effective film can be as a vehicle to kind of just normalize certain ideas and turn them into kind of common sense, no? And of course, this is one of the people that write scripts. Sometimes they do have these types of agendas, right? Kind of inserting certain ideas, and how natural it might sound for the anti-abortion people to say, of course it's wrong, of course it's abortion is murder, and that's just how life is. That is a fact, right? There's no discussion. And the anti-abortion movement, at least for instance in Mexico, has been relatively strong, or I guess present, not necessarily strong, but present for a few decades now, precisely just based on this hard established fact that abortion is murder. And it's become one way through which the certain sectors of the Mexican right have been able to keep themselves sort of relevant, or at least visible in the media, kind of in the public sphere, etc. That is tends to be their main focus. And that's why Verástegui, when he launched his candidacy, or when he was campaigning, he made a lot of emphasis precisely on this issue, right? He was trying to appeal to this supposed common sense amongst Mexican Catholics, but not all Mexican Catholics actually agree that this is the actual ultimate cause for which we must fight. And this was my way, of course, of avoiding talking about my book, but I'll tell you something about my book. It is a difficult question at this point. But so the book is about, and I can give you kind of the title that it has for now, at least. It's Crusaders, Nationalism, Anticommunism, and Right-Wing Politics in Cold War Mexico. And I went for that title, Crusaders, because it gives a sense of what some of the, let's say, main characters or main organizations that I study in the book, their approach to politics, right? This is not, the politics of deliberation and negotiation and so on and so forth. This is about, we are on a crusade against this thing that we call communism, that of course encompasses a whole bunch of things. And what I do is I study different groups on the spectrum of the right that share, again, the fear against communism or the struggle against communism, and how these groups were important for Cold War Mexico. We tend to study mostly, let's say, government actors and then the left, but then these other organizations on the right, civic organizations, student groups, so on and so forth, were also very important. And, they appear in the newspapers, they're, doing propaganda, and we just haven't studied them enough, I think. And it has also been helping me understand a little bit of people like Verástegui, right? Or these organizations that are today still alive and operating in Mexico. Where do they come from? What makes them still be visible and present, but not strong enough to, let's say, gain spaces and power, or let's say win the presidency? This is kind of trying to study their weakness rather than their strength. It's kind of this
instead of giving them a roadmap of here's how you guys could get your shit together.
Yeah, or saying, look, it's just not, it's a strange case, because if we think about, I don't know, the right in Brazil or in Argentina, a lot of the explanation for their strength is, well, these countries had military dictatorships that were, straightforward, like very right wing, right, and created a base of support and legitimacy. The right wing in Mexico is not quite like that, right? The PRI, because it was so wishy-washy and so, again, such a chameleon, tended to be repressive against the right. They didn't want these Catholic right-wingers to come to power, no? So this is some of the things that I study in the book are precisely this, the importance of right-wing politics that we haven't studied enough for the Mexican context, and then trying to explain this important public presence, since Catholicism is, again, such an important cultural force in Mexican society, but then also how weak they have actually been as political groups, let's say.
I wonder what both parties, or not both parties, but some of these more conservative types, especially the ones that don't think that the current coalition on the right is conservative enough or Catholic enough, think of the fact that we have in Mexico 2 women leading major coalitions in the run for the presidency. Like, I mean, doesn't that have also something to play into their personal politics in terms of what it means to be a conservative and a conservative country, a conservative culture that still ties into patriarchy and to some extent still to Mexican machismo in a sense? Like, I'm sure some of that plays into the antagonism that people like Verastegui might have against, for instance, Xochitl, right? I mean,
the gender politics, can be very much in your face, in Mexican society. And the fact that you have 2 female presidential candidates is very new. This wasn't an explicit point in Verastegui's platform, but part of the attraction of his candidacy for, the hardcore conservatives was, we need a man. Women don't belong in these types of leadership positions, right? Maybe some of them are a little bit more reformed and moderate about that specific issue. But I think for the most part, he, in the end, Verástegui represents this, very macho, good-looking figure, and, anti-feminist, of course, so on and so forth. So I think there is an element there, and we'll see how it plays out now that we're kind of entering the decisive months of the campaigns, how, let's say, discourses of misogyny attacking the 2 candidates are going to play out, no? And this is, of course, aside from what the extreme right might say, there is still, a very macho and misogynistic public culture in Mexico. So we're starting to see that, right? Attacks against Xochitl Gálvez for being la vieja sonsa, or I don't know, right? Wow. This use of vieja, right? That very derogatory term to refer to women, being used to attack both Claudia Sheinbaum and Xochitl Gálvez.
So will this be the first time in Mexican history that there's a woman president?
Yes. First time. So that's pretty significant.
Very significant.
And very, very significant. And we'll see. It's going to be interesting to see how this kind of conservative movements, conservative wing of Mexican politics, how they deal with that, right? I think this is what you were saying, Ruben, is that it seems like there's going to be kind of a shock moment.
Right.
Or they're gonna realize that.
And what is your prediction? The outcome of the election? Like, is there one candidate that is hotter than the other one at this point?
A lot of people say anything can happen, right? But the most likely outcome is that Claudia Sheinbaum is gonna win the election. That's just kind of looking at the numbers and how weak the Xochitl Gálvez's candidacy has been so far.
Mm-hmm.
So
interesting.
And again, it's gonna be again, an interesting moment, right? If it does come to happen, first woman president, maybe a possibility that Morena will kind of morph it into something else. We'll see what López Obrador does in order to stay relevant, or is he actually going to retire from politics, which I don't think so, but we'll see.
Well, he can't be president again, right? He only served one term. That's it. And
but he can be the power behind the curtain.
Right. So
I'm the Siwacoat to the Tlatuani.
Tying it in. So maybe, I don't know, maybe you can remind us a little bit about which one of the candidates you said claims indigenous identity or ancestry. But also, I'm thinking here, like, there's a parallel with the PRI, right? With the PRI and how it survived its early years and its early iteration and its cult of personality to become what it became for 70 years. And I wonder if Morena will also, if it's true that Sheinbaum's going to win and Morena's going to carry on as the leading political party in Mexico, then it might survive AMLO. And so, I mean, it'll probably last another 30, 40 years.
It is possible. And I think that's what they are aiming for, is to, I mean, this is, I think, the current struggle in the party is how do we keep building strength based on López Obrador's leadership, but then how do we look to the future with the possibility of not only consolidating as a party, but staying in power. I mean, and the issue with Xochitl Gálvez and her indigenous identity, I mean, she's very open about it, and I don't think she's necessarily lying, but she's been under attack because her opponents say, well, you're not really indigenous because you don't speak an indigenous language. Or there were some really messed up criticisms which were like, but you're a businesswoman, you cannot be indigenous if you're a businesswoman. Like, okay,
wow.
That's
so
right?
racism is rearing its head.
Exactly,
Anti-indigenous
right.
Racism, as Mexican as apple pie.
Yeah,
Just for that,
so-
TFA will back the indigenous candidate in this race.
We
So I mean, in that sense, it's been an interesting just seeing how the conversation played out, because we don't speak enough about Mexican indigenous peoples in Mexican politics, like their actual representation, participation in decision making.
outside of Benito Juarez, you don't really hear.
Or
Mexican
the actual,
politicians
I mean, or
referred to.
the actual, for instance, there are legislators who are from indigenous communities, but we don't hear about them, and it's only in this very opportunistic way that we get to talk about it. But then the conversation quickly died down and moved on to other things. And a similar issue has been raised with Claudia Sheinbaum's Jewish identity, because there is, of course, a strong or, important undercurrent of anti-Semitism in Mexico.
Yes.
And people that say, she's not even Mexican.
Wow.
She has that, right, the usual anti-Semitic trope of the double allegiance, that she's really loyal to Israel and not to Mexico, right? I don't think it's going to be an effective weapon to take votes away from her, but it's a rhetoric that's kind of out there in social media. No? It's also very interesting to observe that.
So I can just imagine, like, right now, the ire and the fire and the blood of some of these people in Mexico who see not only two women running for president and leading the coalitions. One of them is claiming indigenous identity, and the other one is of Jewish ancestry. So I can just, like, imagine all these conservative head explosions going on throughout Mexico.
Exactly. It's the worst thing that could ever happen, right? Both women and with two identities that are seen as just not fully
acceptable.
Right? One is, the remnants of a barbaric past.
Yeah, the old Mexico, not the modern Mexico.
Right.
And the other one being kind of this,
not a real Mexican.
Not a real Mexican. It's essentially a foreigner, right?
A foreigner, right.
Wow. Also, the people that killed Christ. Right?
That's right.
Which is,
man.
I mean, this is something that it doesn't take much work to find on, maybe not on Facebook. Who uses Facebook anymore? But on the platform formerly known as Twitter, you can find all sorts of examples of people just saying that out in the open. Just
That's wild.
It's a phenomenon.
So anti-indigeneity, anti-Semitism is alive and well in modern day Mexican politics.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah. Good times, people. Good times.
Well, thank you for joining us, Dr. Luis Herrán Ávila.
Well, thanks to you guys for the conversation and getting the chance to to shoot some ideas about this, not just Mexican right-wingers, but, Mexico in general. It's always good to chat about that.
Some of this is going to go in the book, right? Some of this conversation we had is going to make it into the book.
Yeah, I mean, again, because it's hard to... you mean like it's actually...
You're going to cite the
podcast.
Cite the podcast.
Tales from Atlantis episode.
I will for sure thank you guys in the acknowledgements for the chance to just think through these things.
Well, I look forward to the book. I know every time we hang out, that's like the first thing I ask you. Where's your book, bro?
Curly ruins the night every time.
Damn.
Because that's the first thing that he was like.
That sounds like a movie. Curly ruins the night.
Yeah, that's like the name of my autobiography. I think I've got it nailed down. Well, thank you very much. And it's, as always, a pleasure to have you.
Thank you, guys. And remember, the truth is like medicine. It doesn't always taste good, but it is always good for you.
Timoitase. Thank you for listening to Tales from Atlantis, a project of the Chimali Institute of Mesoamerican Arts. If you enjoy the show, please consider becoming a Patreon supporter. You can do this by visiting talesfromatlantis.com and clicking Support the Podcast. Your continued support will help keep the podcast ad-free and independent. Until next time, Timoitase.